The street is calm at first glance, the kind of place where a passing patrol should barely draw attention, yet something in the air feels off before a word is spoken. The officer approaches with a certainty that suggests the outcome is already decided in his mind, but the resident's quiet posture hints at a different story, one shaped by preparation rather than panic. The exchange begins politely enough, but a single misplaced demand exposes cracks in the officer's confidence as the resident counters with an unexpected level of legal clarity. Each sentence lands with increasing weight, shifting the dynamic from assumed authority to measured challenge. The tension doesn't explode. It tightens slowly, like a rope winding around both parties. Viewers feel the pressure rising, unsure whether the officer will adapt, double down, or realize that tonight he has met someone he cannot simply talk over. The moment hangs, sharp and electric, signaling that this routine stop is about to turn into something very different. Image prompts. The officer's tone shifts subtly as he asks the resident to account for their presence, though the question feels more like an assumption than a genuine inquiry. The resident doesn't flinch, maintaining steady eye contact, answering with calm detail that leaves little room for misinterpretation. The silence that follows is heavy, filled with an unspoken warning that the officer's approach is beginning to overstep the boundaries of reasonable questioning. A brief gust of wind sweeps down the street, stirring fallen leaves and carrying the faint hum of distant traffic. Moments like this reveal the fragility of authority when challenged by someone who refuses to be unsettled. The officer recalibrates, searching for a new angle, but each attempt seems to meet a quiet wall of clarity and confidence. The officer takes a step closer, trying to reframe the conversation as a matter of safety, though nothing in the resident's behavior suggests risk. The resident listens without interruption, then responds with a steady, measured explanation that dismantles the implication entirely. There is a visible shift in atmosphere as the officer realizes the simple route of asserting control won't be enough tonight. A porch light flickers on from a nearby house, subtly highlighting the divide between both individuals, one relying on presence, the other relying on knowledge. The resident's voice remains even, neither defensive nor deferential, and the officer's attempts at measured authority begin to sound rehearsed rather than purposeful. Pressure builds in the officer's voice as he introduces procedural wording meant to intimidate, but the resident counters with calm, precise correction. The exchange has lost any sense of routine now. It has become a quiet battle of understanding versus assumption. A passing vehicle slows slightly, its headlights sweeping across both figures before continuing down the road, leaving a brief moment of illuminated tension. The officer hesitates, realizing each misstep is being recorded, and that alone tempers his approach. The resident stands firm, speaking with the clarity of someone who has prepared for encounters exactly like this, turning the imbalance of authority into something far more equal. The officer attempts to regain footing by shifting the conversation toward identification, but the resident responds with lawful boundaries delivered in composed, unwavering tone. The officer's frustration becomes harder to mask, evident in the slight tightening of his jaw and the growing pauses before each new question. The resident, however, remains collected, grounding the entire encounter through calm certainty rather than confrontation. The surrounding street remains still, as though holding its breath, with only the faint rustle of hedges in the evening breeze. By now it is clear that this is no ordinary stop. It is a moment where the limits of authority are being tested gently but firmly, and the officer is struggling to keep pace. The officer attempts to regain control by leaning harder on formal language, but each phrase feels increasingly hollow as the resident answers with calm, precise reasoning. The tension between them begins to show in small ways. A slight shift of the officer's weight, a longer pause before the next question, a subtle glance down as he searches for footing. The resident, steady and unshaken, keeps the conversation grounded in facts rather than emotion, forcing the officer to confront the gaps in his own assumptions. A quiet stillness settles over the street, broken only by distant footsteps and the hum of a nearby lamp. What should have been a simple exchange now feels like a test neither expected, and the officer's uncertainty grows with every confident response he receives. The officer changes tactic, shifting from authority to implication, suggesting the resident's behavior appears suspicious. But the resident meets the insinuation head-on, responding with a clarity that dismantles the suggestion before it gains traction. Each word delivered is firm but controlled, leaving no opening for misinterpretation. The officer's frustration flickers through his expression as he realizes the usual methods of pressure aren't taking hold. A breeze sweeps down the road, rustling nearby hedges and carrying brief echoes of passing cars. The resident stands rooted, grounded by a confidence built on understanding rather than defiance. The officer's attempts to steer the narrative begin to falter, and for a moment the balance between them becomes visibly unstable. The officer tries to assert that the encounter could be resolved quickly if the resident simply cooperates, but the underlying message reveals itself as an attempt to bypass proper procedure. The resident's response is measured and unwavering, laying out their rights with such clarity that the officer momentarily loses his next line of questioning. The air thickens with the weight of the exchange, each passing second amplifying the officer's unease. Nearby windows hold faint silhouettes of neighbors, watching quietly from behind curtains. The resident's calm tone reinforces control without hostility, while the officer's persistence begins to sound more like desperation than authority. What was once an assertive approach now feels more like a grasping attempt to salvage control. The officer doubles down, insisting that failure to comply could escalate matters, but the resident counters with a clear reminder of proportionality and lawful thresholds. The officer's eyes narrow slightly, revealing the pressure he feels as his authority is tested more directly than expected. The resident, unmoved, maintains a steady voice that highlights the contrast between lawful confidence and frustrated force. A passing cyclist glances over briefly, sensing tension before continuing on. The moment grows heavier as the officer realizes the resident is not only informed, but prepared to stand their ground without wavering. The tone of the conversation shifts toward an uncomfortable truth. Authority is only effective when backed by understanding. The officer takes a brief step back, trying to reframe the situation as cooperative rather than confrontational, but the strain in his voice betrays the effort. The resident listens carefully, responding with a calm explanation that outlines exactly why the officer's approach has drifted beyond what is reasonable. The officer's facade of control slips further, replaced by a quiet frustration he struggles to hide. The resident's confidence grows, not out of triumph, but from the clarity that the law supports their stance. The street remains hushed, the atmosphere dense with the clash between knowledge and assumption. By the end of the exchange, the officer appears less like an enforcer and more like someone trying to steady a situation he no longer fully commands. The officer pauses, caught off guard as the resident calmly references specific legislation that directly challenges the basis of the stop. For the first time, the officer's certainty wavers in a way that is impossible to hide, his eyes briefly shifting toward the patrol car, as if searching for support or confirmation. The resident maintains a steady tone, not confrontational, simply factual, allowing the silence that follows to speak louder than any raised voice. A stillness settles over the street, the world seeming to narrow around the two figures locked in a quiet contest of knowledge versus assumption. The officer's authority, once projected with confidence, now feels fragile as he attempts to compose a response that fits within the limits he's suddenly aware of. This moment marks the beginning of a shift, neither expected, but both now feel. The officer tries to recover, clearing his throat before offering an explanation that sounds more like guesswork than procedure. The resident listens patiently, letting the officer speak without interruption before responding with clarity that leaves no room to maneuver. The officer's expression tightens as he realizes he is being held to the exact standards he expected to wield. A window opens nearby, someone leaning slightly out to observe, the quiet presence adding pressure the officer cannot ignore. The resident's composure only highlights the growing imbalance, each word delivered with the confidence of someone who understands exactly where the limits lie. The officer's frustration simmers beneath the surface, but it is tempered by the awareness that every second is being recorded. The officer shifts to a softer approach, attempting to regain rapport by suggesting he is merely trying to ensure everything is in order. But the resident replies with a balanced mix of politeness and precision, making it clear they understand their rights without antagonizing the officer. This calm assurance forces the officer into a moment of reflection, and he glances toward the recording phone, realizing the risks of continuing down an unsteady path. The air feels heavier, almost charged, as both parties hold their positions. A distant dog bark echoes across the street, adding to the sense of quiet suspense. The conversation now feels like a negotiation of principles, one where the resident holds the stronger footing through knowledge and restraint rather than force. Realizing the resident isn't easily swayed, the officer tries to justify his actions with procedural language, but the resident calmly dismantles each point with clear references to lawful requirements. The officer's shoulders lower involuntarily, signaling the pressure he feels as each attempt meets a composed response. A passing pedestrian slows down momentarily, sensing tension, before continuing with a cautious glance back. The resident's quiet confidence makes each correction feel heavier, and the officer's reliance on assumed authority grows increasingly transparent. By now, the encounter has shifted from confrontation to an unspoken acknowledgement that the officer is losing ground, and he knows it. The officer exhales slowly, trying to regain stability in the conversation by returning to basic questions. But the resident answers each one with unwavering clarity that leaves little space for ambiguity. The power dynamic has fully shifted. The officer's tone is no longer commanding but careful, measured as though he is weighing every word. The resident maintains steady control, not by force but through calm understanding of the legal framework guiding the moment. The street feels suspended in a tense quiet, the kind that hints a resolution is near but not yet certain. The officer's voice softens as he acknowledges the resident's points indirectly, marking a subtle yet unmistakable retreat. The turning point has crystallized into something the officer cannot deny. The resident is not just informed, they're immovable. The officer steadies himself and tries once more to regain the upper hand, adopting a tone that blends formality with a faint trace of irritation. He repeats earlier points with slightly different wording, hoping the repetition will finally unsettle the resident, but the response he receives is as controlled and clear as ever. The resident explains step by step why the officer's justification doesn't meet the required legal thresholds, doing so without raising their voice or allowing emotion to creep in. A quiet pause follows, and in that silence the officer's facade wavers. He realizes that pushing any harder risks exposing the weaknesses in his reasoning. The resident, sensing this, remains still, maintaining the steady composure that has guided them throughout the encounter. The balance of the moment shifts again, not through force, but through quiet, undeniable accuracy. Trying a different tactic, the officer adopts a more conversational tone, suggesting he is simply trying to clarify the situation. But the resident recognizes the shift immediately and responds with the same steady precision, gently steering the interaction back to factual grounds. The officer's attempt at casual rapport falters under the weight of the resident's confidence, and the moment highlights the growing divide between intent and execution. A car door slams distantly, briefly punctuating the tension hanging in the cool evening air. The officer's expression tightens again, caught between frustration and a dawning understanding that he has reached the limits of what he can reasonably demand. The resident continues to stand firm, their words grounded in legality rather than emotion, leaving the officer little room to maneuver. The officer attempts to reassert authority by referencing procedure, but the resident responds with a measured explanation that reveals gaps in his understanding. Each correction is delivered with calm restraint, neither mocking nor confrontational, and that control makes the officer's missteps feel even more pronounced. The street remains quiet except for the distant hum of a passing vehicle, emphasizing the stillness surrounding the standoff. The officer glances toward his patrol car again, as though hoping to find justification waiting somewhere within it. The resident continues speaking, with the confidence of someone who knows precisely where the boundaries lie. And the officer's shoulders sink a little more as the weight of the moment settles on him. What once felt like authority now feels like exposure. The tension becomes more visible as the officer tries to justify why he initiated the stop, offering fragmented explanations that drift away from consistency. The resident listens without interruption, then responds with a concise breakdown of why those explanations don't align with lawful grounds. The officer shifts awkwardly, clearly aware that his reasoning is beginning to unravel. A faint breeze rustles through the hedges, adding a subtle atmospheric edge to the moment. The resident's tone remains even and measured, contrasting sharply with the officer's increasingly hesitant delivery. By now, it is clear that the officer is no longer leading the exchange. He is simply reacting to the resident's steady clarity. What began as an assertion of authority has transformed into a quiet lesson in accountability. The officer exhales deeply, his composure thinning as he attempts one final justification, but the resident counters with such clarity that the tension shifts entirely. The officer realizes that continuing on this path risks crossing a line he cannot defend, and the realization settles visibly in his expression. The resident maintains steady posture, offering no sign of aggression, only certainty. The street feels heavier now, the kind of quiet that mirrors the officer's internal conflict as he weighs whether to continue or step back. The resident's final explanation lands with a quiet decisiveness, making it clear that the limits of lawful authority have already been reached. What remains is a moment of reluctant acceptance from the officer, who is left standing in the shadow of the resident's unwavering control. The officer takes a small step back, his voice softening as he tries to recover what little authority he feels he still has. The defensive edge that once shaped every word now fades into something quieter, almost reflective. The resident listens with the same steady composure that has carried them through the entire encounter, offering a short but precise clarification that gently reinforces the boundary the officer had crossed. The moment hangs in the cool evening air, as the officer realizes his attempts to lead the situation have gradually slipped from his control. The street around them feels calmer now, as though the tension that once wrapped around the conversation has been replaced by a reluctant understanding. The officer shifts his stance, recognizing that stepping back is the only to restore balance, without escalating matters further. A quiet pause settles as the officer reevaluates his approach, choosing this time to speak with a more measured and deliberate tone. He explains his perspective, though the uncertainty layered beneath it is clear, and the resident acknowledges his points without conceding their own position. The conversation takes on a different shape now, less confrontational, more reflective, yet the underlying imbalance is still present. The resident's responses remain concise and unshaken, creating a calm rhythm that prevents the moment from reigniting tension. The officer rubs the back of his neck briefly, a subtle sign of strain as he weighs the consequences of continuing the exchange. With each passing second, the tone shifts further away from confrontation, settling into the early stages of reluctant resolution. The officer attempts to summarize the situation in a way that allows him to step back without overtly admitting fault. His voice steadies, but the edges of uncertainty remain. The resident responds with a calm, balanced explanation that reinforces both their position and the lawful reasons behind it. There's no triumph in their tone, only a quiet desire to bring the encounter to a close without unnecessary friction. The officer nods slowly, absorbing the final points with a seriousness that wasn't present earlier. The atmosphere feels lighter, yet still grounded by the earlier tension that has not fully dissipated. Both individuals now recognize the moment for what it has become: a controlled de-escalation built on the resident's consistent composure and the officer's gradual acceptance. A subtle shift occurs as the officer's tone transitions from defensive to conciliatory, an acknowledgement that continuing the exchange offers nothing more but risk. The resident remains steady, responding with the same clarity that has shaped the entire encounter, offering final details that help anchor the interaction within proper boundaries. A light breeze moves between them, softening the tension that once seemed unbreakable. The officer glances briefly at the recording phone, reminded again of the accountability threaded through every word spoken tonight. Though neither voices it openly, both recognize the moment's significance, the officer withdrawing not through defeat, but necessity, and the resident demonstrating how calm knowledge can redirect an entire encounter. The street seems noticeably quieter as the conversation nears its end. The final shift arrives as the officer gives a muted acknowledgement, a subtle acceptance that the situation has run its course. His voice carries a newfound restraint, shaped not by authority, but by understanding. The resident responds with a final grounded statement, reinforcing their lawful position without pressing further. The air between them feels clearer now, as though the weight of tension has finally lifted. The officer steps back toward his patrol car, not hurried, but with a quiet sense of closure. The resident remains still, maintaining their composure until the officer fully withdraws. The moment ends not with confrontation, but with a mutual unspoken agreement. The boundaries have been re-established, the lesson acknowledged, and the encounter finally brought back under control. As the officer reaches his patrol car, he pauses, turning back with a softer expression, his earlier tension reduced to something closer to reflection. He offers a brief explanation, framing the evening's events as a misunderstanding rather than an overreach. Though the strain in his voice suggests he knows, the resident sees through the attempt. The resident listens calmly, acknowledging the explanation with a measured response that neither inflames nor dismisses the situation. A brief silence lingers between them, carrying the weight of everything that has unfolded. The officer nods once, accepting the resident's points without argument, signaling the start of a genuine de-escalation. The street feels still again, as though the night is finally catching up with the moment. The officer shifts his stance and attempts to clarify the official reasoning behind the initial stop, though his words now carry less certainty than earlier. The resident listens closely before offering a firm but polite explanation of the lawful limits that shaped their response. The officer absorbs the information with a slow nod, attempting to reconcile his assumptions with the facts now presented to him. A dog barks somewhere down the road, momentarily breaking the stillness, but neither individual is distracted. The conversation has narrowed to a final, necessary exchange of understanding. The resident's calm tone maintains control of the moment, helping guide the encounter toward its natural conclusion. A subtle shift occurs as the officer acknowledges, indirectly, that the resident's grasp of the law is stronger than he initially anticipated. His voice carries a mix of humility and caution, aware that every word still matters. The resident responds with the same measured approach, reinforcing their earlier points without pressing for an apology or escalating the tone. The officer's expression softens further, the tension that once drove his behavior dissipating into something closer to genuine understanding. The ambient hum of a distant vehicle fills the pause that follows, grounding the moment in a sense of closure. Both recognize that the confrontation has effectively ended, and what remains is a final, quiet exchange of respect. Unspoken, but unmistakable. The officer offers a final clarification, attempting to frame the evening's tension as a rare misunderstanding. The resident, though composed, gives one last explanation that gently but firmly reinforces the boundaries that were crossed. The street is still, the earlier intensity replaced by cool evening air and the distant murmur of traffic. The officer's posture shifts into something more open, an unspoken acceptance that the resident handled the encounter with more clarity and restraint than expected. For a brief moment, the officer seems almost grateful for the lack of hostility, a stark contrast to how the evening began. The resident nods once, signaling that the exchange has reached its end. With the last points exchanged, the officer steps back fully toward his vehicle, his tone now reserved and cautious. The resident remains steady, offering no hostility, only a composed stance that reflects the confidence they carried through the entire encounter. A feeling of closure settles over the street as the officer gives a muted nod, an implicit acknowledgement of the resident's correctness. The resident's calm silence holds the moment in balance, allowing the officer to withdraw without further tension. The soft glow from nearby windows casts a gentle light across the pavement, signaling that the encounter has finally reached its natural conclusion. What lingers is a quiet reminder of how clarity and composure can redirect even the most uncertain situations. As the officer settles into the driver's seat, the patrol car's internal lights briefly illuminate his expression. No longer tense, simply resigned. He starts the engine, the soft hum blending into the quiet street as he prepares to leave. The resident remains still, watching without triumph, holding the same calm clarity that guided them throughout the encounter. The moment feels suspended in a thin layer of cool night air, the kind that sharpens every sound, every movement, every breath. The officer gives one last nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of the boundaries he now understands more clearly. The resident's steady presence mirrors the principle at the heart of the night. Authority must stand within its limits. As the patrol car rolls away, the street slowly exhales. The resident takes a single step back toward their driveway, letting the tension of the encounter ease from their posture. The fading red glow of the patrol car's rear lights stretches across the damp pavement, gradually shrinking as the vehicle turns the corner. The quiet returns quickly, settling over the street like a long-forgotten blanket. The resident breathes deeply, acknowledging the weight of what just unfolded. Not anger, not relief, but a grounded certainty that standing firm was necessary. The neighborhood remains still, the hum of distant traffic the only reminder that life continues beyond the moment. In the space left behind, the resident reflects on how easily such encounters can shift, and how vital it is to stay composed. As silence fully settles, the resident lowers their recording phone, the bright screen dimming against the night. The device, once a crucial tool for protection, now feels lighter in their hand. The reality of the moment begins to unravel in their thoughts. The officer's assumptions, the missteps, the steady corrections that carried the exchange toward resolution. They walk slowly toward their front door, each step measured, as though the street itself still holds the echo of the confrontation. The encounter replays in fragments, not to dwell on tension, but to understand the lesson it provided. Knowledge turned a difficult moment into a manageable one. Composure kept it from spiraling. The resident pauses before entering the house, glancing back at the quiet road as if confirming the moment has fully passed. A faint breeze moves through the trees, stirring the shadows along the pavement. The earlier confrontation now feels distant, softened by the calm that has returned. Yet the significance of it remains sharp, a reminder that rights matter most when pressure is applied. The resident reflects briefly on how easily authority can drift without challenge, and how essential it is to understand the limits set by law. With a final steady breath, they turn back toward the doorway, carrying the quiet confidence earned through the night's events. Inside the home, the resident sets the phone aside and lets the night settle fully around them. The street outside is silent again, ordinary and unchanged, but the encounter has left a subtle imprint, one that reinforces the importance of knowing how to stand firm without escalation. For viewers, the takeaway is clear. Rights are not confrontational tools, but protective ones. Composure isn't weakness, it's authority rooted in understanding. As the scene closes, the resident moves calmly through their home, the tension of the night replaced with grounded assurance. And for anyone watching, the message lingers. Stay informed, stay steady, and always let the law guide your steps when pressure rises.